Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here at the end of a full day. I have a cup of coffee, and you shouldn't be shy to have one either. Take care of yourself. Like I said, I realize it's the end of a full day, so do whatever you need to do to stay engaged, and I'll do my best to make sure that I offer up something engaging. My name is Jim May, and this is the name of the session you're in. Does your school know how to learn? So a couple quick housekeeping things before we dive in. One, like any of the sessions at NTAC today, or excuse me, all week, there's a collection in the NTAC group with resources associated with the session in there. The PowerPoint slides are in there if you just want to have them up in front of you. But I'll also tell you there's a second set of PowerPoint slides that I'll show right at the end of the session, which have very detailed notes. And those are designed to be much more useful to you as a participant in the wake of the session as you go back and think about and hopefully think about how to utilize these ideas in your own work. Two, this session is being streamed to an empty room somewhere, probably. So that's why the microphone and Zach in the back. And so if you catch me doing things like really repeating everything that gets said, that's the reason why. So there's a streaming audience, well, of at least Zach, who's got, I think, his computer open. But other than that, we'll do our best to accommodate to them, even though the session is still really designed for the experience in the room and not for a virtual audience. All right. With that said, we'll get into sort of where we're headed with this session. I mentioned this to some of you. I saw you this morning, and welcome back. And this is one of a series of 3 sessions that's all about our learning organization framework, our NTAC Network's learning organization framework. As you've noticed from looking at the app and looking at the program, we've got an amazing variety of great sessions about how to build better projects, how to improve your classroom, really how to drive classroom instruction. And this is one of a small sort of group of sessions that's really about how you drive improvement at the whole school level. It's really about thinking about moving an entire school forward and doing it in a way that's sort of consonant and consistent with the way we think about project-based learning and inquiry-based learning. Okay? And so that's what we're going to get after today. Some of you, as I mentioned, or as you know, were with me this morning as I try to give at least one sort of gratuitous, meaningless animation in each PowerPoint that I do. So this is your fix right now. The session that some of you were with me for this morning was focusing on the core, and that this big triangle with all the crazy text around it is that framework that I mentioned to you, that learning organization framework. Our time together this morning in this session focusing on the core was all about how you identify a focus. How do you choose a meaningful focus that really guides your improvement efforts as a whole school? So those resources are in, again, the collection if you want to look back at those later on. But so let me just put on the table right now, one of the premises of this framework is that the whole school comes together around getting better at something specific. Okay, that we're not all off in our own corners doing something. There are times when that's not possible, and we could talk about how to sort of mold this framework to that setting, and that's possible. But the premise is, the preferred scenario is the whole school is coming together around one thing that really drives your improvement efforts. This afternoon, we're out here, so we're really going to focus our attention today on the outside, on the triangle. And that triangle for us are really about conditions in your school that impact learning, not just student learning, but actually the ability of the adults to learn and the ability of the school to learn as a system and improve as a system. Okay? And then tomorrow afternoon, there's a session called, or tomorrow morning, I believe, actually, a session called the Mother Project, which is really about this cycle of inquiry that you see here in the middle. So really what sort of the churn and the work of improvement looks like in a concrete way for schools as they do that. So those are the 3 different sessions and what they're all trying to get at. And taken together as a whole, they would hopefully make this diagram concrete and make it concrete how we think about really driving the improvement of whole schools. Okay? So with that, actually have a task for you to get into sort of right away here. While you're doing that, I'm going to go next door and tell them to pipe down. But if you're here in a school team, you can think about this together. If you're just here by yourself, I'll ask you to think about this and find someone close to you to talk about it. But I want you to think about, whether you're here as a school or thinking about a district, think about a time when you tried to get better, and by you I mean the school or the district, when you tried to get better at something and you didn't. Right? You tried, there was some sort of instructional initiative, whatever, but you tried to improve at something and it didn't work out. All right, and think about what well, first of all, what was it? What were you trying to get better at? What got in the way? Why, what were the obstacles or the impediments to learning and improvement? And then what happened as a result of that setback? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think and flesh out those questions, and I'll give us a few minutes to have some conversation in our tables around the different experiences we've had there. All right? Any questions? Great, have at it. Zach, I was going to do notes on chart paper. Is that going to be problematic? Like, just as I facilitate the conversation after, he's going to chart some things on chart paper. Is that problematic?
Yeah,
okay.
the white paper.
Better? Okay.
Yeah, the problem solving.
Give us about 2 more minutes. are you? Yeah, come on in.
Train teachers on, okay, now what we're done, here's an excellent example of train teachers.
Okay.
It's your 30-second warning.
It was all about what it was.
I still go back to in those things.
All right. Let's come back together. Great. So some lively conversation. Let's hear what you talked about. So what are some of the things, if you're willing to share, what's just name the thing you were trying to get better at as a school or as a district, and one thing that got in the way. You don't have to tell us everything, but one thing that got in the way. Okay. Yeah, Katrina.
We talked about wanting to strengthen our community partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that got in the way was heavily relying on solely facilitators to do that for the entire organization.
Okay, so the thing they were trying to strengthen was community partnerships and really increase sort of the presence of those in projects, I assume? Mm-hmm. Okay, but one of the things that got in the way was it all fell to the facilitators, and I'm assuming along with a bunch of other responsibilities, and it kind of got lost somewhere. Okay. Others?
I'm at a school within a school, so it's we like a NTAC academy within a larger public school. We have like quarter of the population. So we were a race to the top school. So there was a lot of initiatives going down, and there was a lot of school-wide initiatives that we had to participate in that didn't necessarily go along with what we were trying to accomplish. So our I was not able to focus on the PBL and the group process as much as I would have liked to because I had to focus on the school initiatives.
Okay. Yeah, so just lots of swirl around the Race to the Top grant in terms of competing initiatives. And my assumption is usually when that's the case, those initiatives aren't always sort of thoughtfully aligned in advance. Okay. Possibly anyway, I don't know. Maybe that happens sometimes.
We both had the same experience, even though we're at two separate schools. We are also a school within a school, and trying to create the culture that we want within our NTAC school, we often found ourselves competing with the culture of the entire school, and the things that we tried to instill in our kids got lost whenever they passported out of our area or as kids from other small schools came in. It affected our culture, and we didn't really feel like we were getting a consistent support from the overall campus administration.
Okay. So really sort of the lack of a unified or coherent culture. All right. Okay. Others?
Critique, I think.
Oh, okay, great. So literally right, so the skill base, the knowledge base that teachers had available to them to do the work was what stayed the same, stagnant. Other things that came up, yes? Complacency. So just sort of attitude or mindset about the work. Okay. Great. What else came up? Yes, ma'am.
We've had major changes in leadership at the school and district levels, and also in our school teachers that have been already trained in NTAC left, and the new ones that came in didn't get trained.
Great. So regular turnover, and then that turnover sort of compounded by the fact that that meant there were sort of gaps in structures around training and development for those people as they came in. Okay, great. Anything else?
But direction. We didn't have a clear sense of really what we were trying to measure and where we were trying to go.
Great. Purpose/focus, so, or the absence of a clear sense of purpose and focus in terms of what you're trying to improve at. Anything else? Yes.
One thing that you asked last year, you had asked us to do is to do learning together, like in leadership, reading the book, Adaptive Culture. But every time we tried that, it was like the lack of time. Yeah, it was like we said, okay, we'll do it later. Maybe next week. The lack of time was.
So I heard sort of two things in there. One is leadership practice, right, and that not being aligned to what you're trying to accomplish. But one of the things driving that was the absence of time, or time and space for you to do that. Great. Anything else?
Having the relationships needed for effective critical thinking.
Okay. What was to characterize what those relationships were like? So what about them got in the way?
Personality, not following the protocol as needed, just a lot of personality.
Okay.
Feel good.
Literally, it sounds like you just couldn't work together.
Right.
Okay.
And then comfortable sharing with each other.
Okay. Great. Yes, ma'am.
In trying to build back our culture, when half of our staff was brand new, and some of them had the mindset of using like union to justify their resistance to what they don't have to do instead of being on board because that's what's best for the students. And I think we have some people whose mindset is what's best for them.
Yeah, so it really, and what I just highlighted two things that we already had up here that I felt like those were sort of theme or variations on a theme around in terms of, again, a unified culture, really having a coherent, consistent culture that's committed to a common purpose, a common focus in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. Anything else people feel like that we really needs to be on this list? I'm sure we could go on for a while, but and that's a pretty good start. So before we come back and dig into this list a little bit more, one of the things, I was actually at a birthday party for my young daughter. Some of you know who have young kids. My daughter Charlotte is 19 months old. Once you get on sort of the birthday train with young kids, it's like hard to get off. So like every weekend you're at like 2 or 3 birthday parties. And one of them was talking with, it had happened that someone who's there was a teacher at a school in Washington State, a high school teacher at a school in Washington State, and we got talking about just high schools and the work in general, and started talking about collaboration, and he pretty bluntly asked me, why should I work with anybody else? Like what's the incentive for me? And so before we go too much further, I actually want to ask us the question, this session assumes that it's important for the whole school to come together and learn and improve around something. Right? This idea of organizational learning, collective learning. All right? Why does that matter? All right? Mackenzie.
teaching in a classroom, it's isolated. We only have the experiences that we have, and we learn from our own experiences. But when you collaborate with another teacher, you have the opportunity to double your experiences because you can hear from them and learn from them.
Right. So just that collaboration just sort of increases the pool of resources available to you and actually improves your own work. Yeah, Chris.
Ownership, when everyone is involved in either the decision making or what the common goal or the focus is, then they have more dedication to being a part of it rather than I'm just doing something that I'm told that I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, great. Kevin Gant, who many of you know, and don't worry, Kevin, you're not in trouble. Kevin is a big fan of the work and introduced me to Daniel Pink's work around drive and motivation, right? And one of the things in there, one of the things that he finds, right, is autonomy, right? The ability to have some control, some influence over the work we do is actually a motivator for people to do really high quality, high level work. Okay? I saw a hand over here somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
When all the teachers are working towards teaching the same types of procedures, then the students kind of already know what's expected. And so in my opinion, that frees up more time to actually have them pursue academic learning instead of having to spend time in each class learning different procedures or different ways of doing things.
Yeah, there's this power when everyone's on the same page, right? Interestingly, when Sam Chaltain this morning showed the video about the Mission Hill School, and the one teacher was talking, and she said, one of the things I value most about being here is my autonomy. But the interesting thing is actually she wasn't acting autonomously at all, right? What that school had was a really well-defined, clear sense of purpose and the set of things that they were all committed to. And then everybody was empowered to make decisions around how to advance those things. Right? But she wasn't acting in isolation. And so because those things happened over and over and over again throughout the school had a very well-defined sense of purpose and a really robust culture that amplified and advanced that purpose. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Take one more that stands out about why it's important. John.
I just, for the sheer thing alone, that man's a social animal anyways. I mean, the fact that we need somebody to go through, we always talk to our teachers that with all the changes that are coming up, if you're not going through this with somebody, it just makes it even that much harder.
Yeah.
It's just the idea of being together definitely has helped.
Yeah, just that there is something, and we hear this all the time in the network, right? That people say, I've never worked this hard and I would never go back to what I used to do, right? That there is just this power and sort of togetherness and solidarity around trying to achieve something that's bigger than we are individually. I'm going to add to your reasons, and that is a really actually powerful list, but I'm going to add a few things just from a slightly sort of more organizational lens to that list that I think are really important for us to understand is why this matters so much, why it's so important for us to think about how the school improves as a collective and not just how we improve as individuals who happen to occupy the same building. Okay. The first one I'd offer to you is this. Individual performance and collective performance aren't the same thing. You can have a building full of great teachers in a really mediocre school. If you have any aspiration at all of being a great school, and by a great school I mean a school that consistently, year in, year out, produces the outcomes you care about for kids, you've got to recognize the fact that your fate is bound up with the person in the classroom next to you. And we've got to set about organizing the work in such a way that acknowledges and doesn't try to avoid that reality. Second, this came up. Katrina and Bobby mentioned this just a moment ago, right? In terms of their leadership team really trying to get traction around a set of practices, and a set of practices that they wanted to see happen in terms of the staff and the way they were working together. But one of the myths of schools is that you can have two separate cultures, right? That you can have sort of a separate adult culture and a separate student culture. The reality is you always get one culture. One of those two is going to sort of exert sort of a gravitational pull on the other one, and it is almost universally the adult culture that wins out. Never, ever visited a school where the adults are more intellectually engaged where the students are more intellectually engaged than the kids. Never ever visited a school where the students collaborate at a level higher than the adults. Right? The way the adults operate, the way the adults perform, the way they work together, the culture of the adults actually operates as a ceiling for the culture of the students. And lastly, this one, you guys named this one as well when we were talking about some of the things that got in the way of your own efforts around improvement. This is a concept, actually, this idea of VUCA. You see these 4 red terms around that circle, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's actually a concept that comes to us from the Army War College. That's comforting, isn't it? Right, and it's an idea that came about thinking about when units are operating in sort of combat environments, that they're just really hard, it's really hard to plan. I mean, these are volatile places. They change quickly and dramatically, and so how do you prepare for that? How do you prepare to operate in a place that's just changing all the time, where stability isn't a feature of the environment? And it came up as we talked about high turnover, and then there weren't structures in place. Right? Schools, and new tech schools in particular, tend to operate in pretty volatile environments. One, schools are volatile in part because of the way we structure them around democracy. Right? Board elections, changes in superintendents, all wield a significant influence on what the priorities of a district and a local school are. Individual staff turnover, right? Any number of things that make the places that you try to do the work, they mean that they're changing all the time, right? And so a really important capacity for the school, if you want to keep producing great outcomes for kids, is your ability as a collective unit to learn your way out of problems you didn't anticipate. So the school really has to be able to sort of learn its way out. Principals in here, when you plan your whole year and staffing and resources and professional development around the budget you got in April, and then you get the actual budget on August 1st, right? You've got to figure out how to navigate that and still achieve or enact your purpose, right? And so having a way to learn and sort of figure these things out collectively, right, really has a huge impact on the ability of the school, again, to continuously achieve your purpose, even as all these things that you guys have already named to some degree come up. So those are three add-ons to what you guys already named about why thinking about how the school learns as a whole unit, as an organization, as a system, are really important. So let's talk about things, let's get at that. So that brings us back to our triangle. So let's look at, again, the outside edges of the triangle are the focus for our time together. And let's come back to the list that you generated here a minute ago. Okay? And let's just go down the list, and I want you to think, can we sort these using this framework? So let's just start here. So everything fell to the facilitators, to the teachers, and because they were overwhelmed with other tasks, it fell by the wayside. Could that fit anywhere in here? Yeah, on the triangle. I'm sorry, on the outside, yes. I heard a word. Leadership. What about, how does it fit in there?
You need to have a leader who, you can't just have it go on to all of the facilitators. There has to be a person who's going to come back and kind of check and make sure, be that go-to person when there's an issue. So you need to have that leadership.
Okay, so there's an important leadership function there, but I also heard you talking about just supports around that, right? Which would make me think more around over here, right? So, when Katrina and Bobby mentioned that, these people don't have time to do it. They don't have time to do this in addition to the other list of the other responsibilities they already have. Okay. And so figuring out sort of structures that enable them to do that, if that's something that's really important. Let's keep going here. Competing initiatives. Where would this fit in this diagram? Yeah, so definitely structures, but where else does it show up? And you can look at the whole diagram. What? Yeah. Right? Not having a clear focus. We talked about this a little bit this morning in the session on finding a focus for your school. One of the things that's actually sort of paradoxically true about having a clear focus is it helps you make better sense of all the initiatives that get thrown at you. What tends to happen when you don't have a focus is you just do them all, right? When you have a focus, it gives you a lens to sort of make sense of them and start to piece them together in a way that they align as best as they possibly can with what you're already trying to accomplish and what you've already decided is important to you as a school community. Michael.
It's like the concept that we run into the military, you don't prioritize because everything is important, nothing.
Right, right. Yeah, so it's strange. A lot of times we feel like we can't have a focus because there's so many things that we're held accountable for or important. But one of the things that's actually really interesting is when schools have a really clear focus, it helps them manage all those other things more effectively. It helps them bring them into alignment with what they're trying to accomplish. So that's kind of a gimme. All right. Culture, yeah, clearly showing up down here. Let's see. So knowledge and skill base for teachers. How does that show up? Yeah, sort of right. Processes that support learning, right? So things that can actually drive and could have changed what Dan mentioned in terms of increasing the knowledge and skill of the teachers. Let's see what else we got. Leadership, also kind of low-hanging fruit there. Complacency, where does that show up in here? Culture, right? Right, and sort of, and we'll unpack these ideas a little bit more in just a moment. But turnover, we talked about. Right, is showing up in just sort of the volatility in the environment. Does it show up anywhere in here? I think, yeah, it's part culture, and then I think I also heard someone say a structure, right? You can have structures that help mitigate the impact of things like that.
Or don't have structure.
Or you don't, and then it amplifies the structure. Absolutely, okay? Relationships, culture. Okay, so you see you get the idea here, right? The idea is that these three sort of sides of the triangle represent sort of major categories of things that tend to impede or undermine our ability to improve as a whole school, our ability to improve as a system. Okay, and so towards the end of our session, we'll kind of walk through the whole diagram and think about how it works. But what we want to do now is spend a little more time unpacking what these things are, and then get you thinking about the ways in which your school either reflects those things or doesn't reflect those things at this time. Okay, so the first one, culture's on the bottom because, I mean, you hear people at NTAC say this all the time. You guys in NTAC schools know this, but culture is really foundational. Okay, it's just a really foundational piece of the work. So let's start with that. These are just quick definitions. Psychological safety, just this idea that people are comfortable, people feel empowered to express dissenting opinions, right? And having an environment that people are okay with that. There was a comment about relationships and not being able to do critical friends protocols well and so on and so forth, right? A lot of times that gets at this, that people don't feel comfortable making the types of comments that really push or challenge one another, right? Or that people will make them in such a way that they shut the learning down, right? Because they're not generous or they're not specific. Naming elephants, right? This is one that people tend to sort of latch onto. So I want you to be careful here. Naming elephant, this is our ability to bring up and sort of wrestle with a really sensitive issue. Okay? And the thing about elephants is they're things that you don't fix easily, right? I mean, that's why they're sensitive issues to begin with, right? If it was easy, you would have done something about it already. Okay? They tend to be these big sort of intractable things, and if you bring it up, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get resolved right away. Okay? To give you an example, when I was still in a school in Washington, we had a really clear, after a couple of years of sort of existing as a school, we had a really clear race-based achievement gap, which is not uncommon, particularly in Washington, D.C., but we had a very pronounced one. But when the school actually had been sort of constituted and started, we also were part of what was a pretty, from my perspective, pretty crazy lawsuit that had to do, and an element of that was race. It was a lawsuit that in the end we won, and actually everything was thrown out of court. It was a lawsuit that was, this will give you a sense of how sort of nutty it was. It also named then President George W. Bush as an offender. Then Secretary of State Education Rob Page as an offender, the Mayor of Washington, D.C., and Congress, all as people that had done some wrong in this particular lawsuit. So anyway, but what that meant for our community was we couldn't have a meaningful conversation. We couldn't have an honest conversation about the performance of different groups of students in our school. There was too much scar tissue from that. It became this elephant for us that was very difficult to talk about. And it took us about 2 years to get to the point where in a faculty meeting, we could just name that. Not do anything about it, just acknowledge that it was there. Okay. New ideas, just the willingness and desire. So it's not just, it's actually pursuing new ideas, right, that might inform or advance or evolve or innovate our thinking and practice, our openness to those. And then lastly, reflection. I want to be really careful here. Reflection is a term that gets thrown around a lot, okay? And sometimes when you say reflection, people immediately think of like kind of squishy things, some sort of like quasi-meditative, reading poetry activity, right? That's not what we mean here. That doesn't mean that can't be a part of it, but reflection in terms of what I'm talking about here is simply the very intentional and deliberate practice of translating experience into meaning, right? Of setting aside time and using structures and protocols or whatever to take experiences you've had as a school and as a team and translate those into meaning or insight that you're then going to act on, okay? Questions, clarifying questions about any of those quickly, and then I'm going to let you do some thinking about what your school looks like around this. Okay, if they come up, no problem, just throw something at me and I'll try to work my way over to you. So, yeah, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, so your contention, Jim, is that these are the 4 necessary pieces to create the right kind of culture to make your organization oriented.
That's right. I wouldn't say that these are the only elements of culture that exist or that we might come up, but these are 4 things that are particularly important in the lens of having a culture that can really drive learning, that can really stimulate learning. All right, so here's a few questions, and again, sort of as we started, if you're here in a school team, you can talk about this as a school team. If you're here individually, you can find a partner close to you, or you can just think silently in your own about the school in your context. I want you to just use these questions and sort of answer these questions about your school and kind of diagnose where you see yourself or your district around this dimension of culture, okay? So questions to guide your thinking. But just sort of, I'm going to give us about a little less than 10 minutes probably just to do some unpacking here and thinking about where we are and analyze where your school is on this particular dimension of the framework. Any questions? Get to it. Sorry, Andy, I didn't mean to park that right in your way. Okay, so far? Just cue me if I'm not forgetting to do stuff.
The only thing is the guy in red there is like in front of your thing.
Okay.
So if you went over like, that way a little bit, I could kind of see it between those 2 people, but I don't think it's a big deal.
Okay, I can try to pull that out a little bit too. I was trying not to block the screen.
Right.
But I know. Hey, Jason.
You know all these things, you studied all these things. How do you contain yourself, especially when you come to school, ours per se, and you see all these things that are like like these elephants that need to be addressed. How do you contain it within yourself to be like, no, I'll let them address it on their own? Because you're studied, you know what to help us, but you let us figure it out on our own.
Yeah, there's two things that help me do that, and I'll openly admit there are times when I get really frustrated. You know, when I'm out in schools and I'm really frustrated, particularly when I feel like the sort of conditions are there for a school to move forward and we're not doing it. You know, that's sort of the most frustrating sort of sentiment. Two things though, to answer your question, Jason. So one, I've learned that you can't learn for other people. You can't do it. It's impossible. You can't learn for others. There's a certain amount, and you know, you can push and you can go and you can try to accelerate the process through careful work, but there's an element of sort of learning that the people with the challenge have to do the work. They have to do the learning. You can't do it for them. The second thing is just my own experience and my own, and at times I forget this one, is that it's slow work. Like even when people are doing it really well and really intentionally and at a high level, like it's slow work. Like it's not you don't just do it like in one staff meeting on a Wednesday afternoon. Right. You know, like so. I try to keep those two things in my head, but like I said, there are definitely times when I lose sight of those two things when I'm out in schools.
I'm just curious because so many times we could just be like, hey, this is an elephant, fix that. You just let us figure this out on our own. This was wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, sure, just.
Job that we do,
All right, one quick comment and then give you just about 2 more minutes. So as you think about culture, and this will be true as we move on, don't just think, are we good at bad or this, or good or bad at this, right? One quick comment, folks, and I'll give you a couple more minutes here, right? The idea here is a diagnosis, and anytime we're talking about diagnosis or analysis, the point is precision, to get specific about what our challenges are or what our strengths are. So as you have this conversation about culture and as we move through the other elements of the framework, don't just think, oh, we're good at culture or that's something we need to get better at. Try to get specific. What is it that drives the strength of your culture? What is it the thing along that of those 4 sort of buckets under culture that maybe you need to go after specifically as you start to think about this? So try to get precise as you narrow down and unpack your thinking around culture and, like I said, the other 2 elements as we move forward. Give you just another minute or 2 here, and then we'll move forward. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we brought some other people to the table, I guess.
That's cool. Yeah, Bill.
We're trying to get that on this.
Okay. Looks like you're in the right spot. And then, so actually, if you click network groups there, Bill, that'll just shorten the list of ones you got to sift through. And then, literally, they're listed alphabetically. So you just want to find the group is NTAC 2013.
I don't think he has. I did that,
Oh.
and I don't think he has that as one of his options.
Oh, it's not even showing up in the list?
Yeah.
Oh.
I think.
Scroll all, it might be on the third, fourth page somewhere. So we'll just advance here. One more page. I think we're getting. Oh, sorry. Go back one. There we are. NTAC 2013 New Orleans. And hold. I think that's all right. I think it's going to give you an error message. I don't know that for a fact. Nope, you're in. So under collections, you should see the name of this session.
Okay.
And then it's all in there.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, let's come back together. Sorry to interrupt such a robust and animated set of conversations, but do want to keep us moving forward. Anybody just have sort of a particular insight or thing that came out of your conversation and you're thinking about your own context? Michael?
Well, the trust aspect is you've got to build that culture into that for all this to work. And then we have the conversation because there's problems with having some common planning period times. But if you can't address it in the 3 because there's nothing regular about it, and that kind of drives the circle back to the culture. You can't build a culture if you don't have something that happens regularly.
Great. So that's a wonderful segue, which I didn't even pay Michael for, into talking about structure. Right. One quick comment here, and again, it's a place where structure and culture intersect. It came up earlier, a really core practice that goes along with the New Tech schools are critical friends, or is the critical friends protocol. Right? And I've heard, actually just wandering around, I heard a number of you talking about that. In thinking about this first question, I'm going to make a point that I feel like often comes up when I get the privilege of spending time out in schools, which is, if the only time that you and your colleagues exchange critical feedback is during the critical friends protocol, we've missed the point. Right? The idea of the critical friends protocol, one is, yes, to get you good feedback on your projects, but two, and maybe on a bigger level, it's also a really concrete structure. It's a lever you can pull on to trying to create a culture where all the time in conversation and hallways in planning meetings, there's this robust exchange of feedback and thinking and ideas. Right? The idea of critical friends is that it drives a shift in the bigger culture, not that it's the end game itself. Okay. So, we'll take Michael's lead and move forward into thinking about structure. So culture is really, really important, but you can have the best culture in the world, and if you don't have structures that allow you to do the work, it actually goes to waste. Okay? So structure is this other element. So concrete processes for learning, explicit protocols that guide inquiry and analysis, like critical friends. Right? Also notice if you look back at that triangle, there's a little cycle of inquiry in the center, right? That data, that's one of these as well, right? It's a specific process, a really concrete process for learning, an explicit protocol. Time and space. This is a big, when you start thinking about doing sort of deep inquiry analysis and trying to move your school forward, you can't do it in the 30 minutes before bus duty on Tuesday. right? You need meaningful time and space to do that type of work, okay? And so a lot of times that comes up in things like common planning times. It comes up in things like the amount of time available for adult learning and professional development in your calendar and in your daily schedule. But all of those things, if you want to do deep, thoughtful work, you got to have time and space for it, right? It's the reason one of the first things we talk with schools about is your master schedule, right? It's the reason we talk with you about changing the class structure, the physical structure of the class, to accommodate project-based learning. Same thing applies here when you're talking about the work of adults and improving the school. Okay? And then tools for learning, really sort of concrete tools that support learning. Sometimes those can be things like curricular tools. Sometimes there are tools that actually help you sort of collect and make sense of information, right, so that you can act on it. But concrete tools that sort of support that learning. Protocols are, again, another example. There's sort of how many of you have a PLC time in your schedule? Okay. All right. How many of you are part of a professional learning community? Okay. How many of you feel like that's a really, really valuable time, that PLC time? So that's pretty good, actually. All right. That's above average, I will say, when I do this. So one of the things that often happens is we create a time and space structure, and then we don't put anything in that time and space. So it's not just creating a common planning time, it's also thinking about what's the structure that animates that time. Okay, so there's sort of two layers of structure there that are really, really important. Questions about any of these, or clarifying questions about any of these? Oh, Kevin, sorry.
Yeah, so maybe you can help me kind of process where something will fit in, because in our conversation, when Stacey and I were talking about our respective schools, I was talking about this last year, where in many ways I felt like our school culture is on a very good trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
So not perfect, but it has many pieces in place. But
Yeah.
diagnosing what was difficult with last year, there was a stated focus of collaboration over the course of the year, but there wasn't good cleaving to that focus. And some of the diagnosis that we carried out had to do with interesting structures. And so we have PLC time, but we also have whole staff time at the end of school on Tuesdays, right? But the whole staff time was being used as actually, those were breaking up times. So we broke up into smaller groups because we, the leader wanted to increase engagement. And so the diagnosis was we weren't really having enough time to talk as a whole staff, and we weren't using some of that time to really connect one meeting to the next meeting, and the learnings from this meeting to the next meeting. So what that made, I was thinking about that as I'm looking at this list, which I think is really solid. And I'm not sure where to put it, and that is, when do you have the right size of people to carry on a conversation?
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know if that fits in here, but I thought I would share the story to kind of maybe add to that, is that their PLCs are super powerful
Absolutely.
in and of themselves, but unless there's like a cohesive
Absolutely.
conversation with the whole staff, and I think that's a really important structure that is worth mentioning.
Yes, I think it's a huge piece. A couple quick reactions, and then I'll shamelessly promote the other session I'm doing tomorrow, which gets deeper into that question. So one, I think, for example, let's just take this room. We are having a collective conversation. There's sort of collective sense-making happening, but there's also a lot of work happening in small groups, okay? And so I think there is a balance there, and I think you can structure it that way. I think there is something important and powerful about the whole staff being physically together, even when you're working in small groups, but there is, as Kevin raised, there's also this important step where the sense-making, the thought, the action that takes place in those small groups, whether they're PLCs or just breakout groups in your meeting, has to come back to the whole group. If not, you miss out on the collective learning, right? You sort of self-defeating, right? You miss out on the ability for the school to improve as a collective unit. So that's a really, really important piece. I think it is possible to even operate in a PLC structure. Kevin named my big sort of beef with PLC structures, is that they generally just devolve all the responsibility for what you're working on out to a grade level or a department team or whatever the construction of the team is. And to me, there has to be something that sits at the center to bring that all back together. Right? Otherwise, we've just got a bunch of well-intentioned, hardworking, smart people working on a bunch of different stuff that doesn't necessarily move the school forward. Okay. And then Third, again, sort of shameless self-promotion, the session tomorrow about the Mother Project will get at sort of a structure for thinking about how one meeting connects to the next and how you can really drive that and have continuity across an extended period of time. Okay. All right. Sorry? There. That's what I wanted. So again, just a few questions for you to think about. All right, again, I'm going to give you just a few minutes to sort of process, think about your context, your school, your district, whatever it is you're working on at the moment. Use these questions to sort of get a sense of where you are in terms of structures and the way they either advance or impede the work of your school. Okay. All right. Of course.
In that last conversation that you were just having, like talking about the PLC and that one thing that came that with me, like, and I wonder, we have our little, we have plenty of time to plan and work, okay? But the problem is like Juliet and I were both on the same planning period, so we would do critical friends during our planning period, which was great. I mean, I had a great group of people to critical friend with. But the thing is we don't have a time that we can come together and do that. We have our weekly PD, but we always have to do PD. Can you like make a big community? You know what I'm saying?
When you say come together, you mean just the whole staff? Is that what you mean? Okay.
Right, because I mean, one day I was doing critical friends with one group of teachers that needed to do it after school, and when they were going through their thing with their project, I'm like, oh my God, that totally ties in with what it was Steve and Lindsay. Their thing, I'm like, oh my God, that's tying into what Michelle is doing, who also teaches 9th grade, who has the same kids. And I'm like, you guys need to talk. You could probably put this project together. Now, it just so happened that I had been helping Michelle because she is a new teacher as a trainer, and they happened to ask me to do critical friends. We would never have known that. We don't get that time to share, and it ends up being her and I as the trainers that are helping people. They hear about it, and now we're running around trying, you should work with this one. You know what I mean? Like,
And you have a whole staff PD time, but it's always committed to some sort of training or event. Is that right?
It's a structure thing. It has to be because we don't have a common place for all of that to happen.
right.
Which is what they were raising their hands saying we do. And it's beneficial.
You mean like a common planning time?
Not a common planning. You can't do common planning for everybody, but we don't have a time. And whether or not people would, there was they would cause problems and some people wouldn't be on board. If we do these PDs and we don't get to the real things that we need to get to, but the only way to do that is to say, well, yes, we meet on Wednesdays, but could we all meet together? Maybe we have to just say every other Thursday or every other Monday.
Yeah.
Those of you who would like some critical feedback, let's get together and powwow. Maybe if you can't come, you can't come. But maybe if a group of us are coming regularly, it might inspire others to start coming more regularly, and we can start doing that. And so time wouldn't be an issue, but it's going to have to take the dedication of teachers to say, I'm willing to stay after school.
Well, only because I don't know, is all the PD time required? Like, is that built in because there's a certain amount of hours that has to be tackled before the end of the year?
You mean our Wednesday PD?
Any of them?
Well, our Wednesday PD is still part of our workday. It's just an early release for the kids. It's still our contractual time till 3:10, and then we have the contractual 1 hour, meeting once a month. So that's why once a month we're there until 4:10.
So I guess my question then is, couldn't we use some of that Wednesday time
So, I mean, you're getting at a couple things here. So one, I think a good strategy is not, sometimes you need more time, but sometimes you just need to use time differently, which is what I hear you say. And I think and one of the things I also hear you guys talking about is the second question and question number 2, right? Which is sort of how do you decide what you're working on in those times, and what's the structure for that? You know, is it just kind of arbitrary things? Is it always being dictated to us by the district, which happens sometimes? You have to figure things out. So,
There is stuff we can't control.
you know, I think,
in the district.
you know, in situations like that, and everybody has those things. Everybody has some real constraints. They're sometimes different, but everybody has them. You know, I think where you get the most traction is to figure out what it is you want to do and why you want to do it, why it would matter if you were able to do that. And to whoever's part of that challenge, whether it's the district level folks, whether it's your own colleagues in classrooms, whatever, right? Present something that helps them see how some of their interests are going to be sort of protected in that, but also advances what you're trying to accomplish as a school, right? So
we've already created our framework.
Mhm.
We did. And I was working on my statement this morning. Revamping what we had. I wasn't sure.
yeah,
I mean, basically, our focus is creating relevant and rigorous projects,
okay,
which will increase student learning.
Yeah.
You know, applied learning, active exploration. So if that's our focus, and one of our major issues in the past is this no consistency on what happens on Wednesdays. We don't even know. And then there would be days that it's half an hour before the meeting, the director gets called out, and I'm getting a text on my phone saying, this is what's going to happen at PD today, while I'm still teaching.
So to me, when we say focus, it doesn't mean that nothing else is happening in the school, but it means when we come together as a team, that's what we're working on.
We should already know.
Yeah.
What
So
we're focused on.
yeah. So if you say this is our focus, that tells me if I walk into your whole staff meeting, what focus means that's when we're together, that's what we're collectively working on. Okay. And that doesn't mean nothing else is ever happening or nothing else happens in the school, but it's also committing the time that you have together as a collective unit to that focus. So that might mean that you think about how you use your common planning time differently if you really want to preserve that time. It might mean you think about, hey, would we all be willing to give up 20 minutes of common planning time a week in order to create a bigger chunk of time somewhere, right? You can get into different scenarios, but you know, to me, a focus means when we're together, that's what we're focused on.
Well, and here's the other thing.
Yeah. All right, sorry, got to bring us back. All right. In the interest of time, I'm just going to keep us moving here. So let me bring us back up. So the last sort of dimension of this framework, the last side of the triangle, which we haven't talked about yet or haven't given you a chance to unpack yet, is this idea of leadership. So first of all, I want to be really clear that when we talk about leadership in the New Tech Network, we're talking about an activity or a function and not a title or a position. Okay? That said, I also want to be really clear that the formal leaders in your school, whether it's an advocate or a director or a literacy coach, right, the people who have sort of formal authority around areas, have a great power to influence some of the things that we're talking about. You're in an incredibly good position, comparatively speaking, right, to have a lot of influence over the lives of the adults, right, who in turn will wield significant influence over the lives of the students in the building, okay? So first of all, value independent judgment. So sort of the willingness of leaders to entertain, again, sort of this connects to culture around that psychological safety piece, but the willingness of leaders to entertain alternate points of view, dissenting viewpoints, so on and so forth. If we think about this on the cultural side, sometimes this is hard because how many of you have that person on your team that, like, you know, always says like the awkward, uncomfortable thing in the staff meeting, right? And they're kind of right, but they say it in a way that is completely unproductive, right? And so that's kind of what's hard here, right, is that actually it's really important to protect voices of dissent and also work with them on ways to do it that are more effective and productive, right? But those people actually are really good. They help us see things that others miss, right? So the ability to value independent judgment. The woman in, again, the Mission Hill School this morning who talked about her autonomy, it wasn't that she was just out there doing her own thing. It was she was empowered to make meaningful decisions around how to advance their purpose and mission. Right? She was empowered to make independent judgments, but around a shared purpose. Okay? Shared responsibility. This really gets at this idea, if you've ever walked through a school and like seen something that you know that's a problem, but really I can let the social studies department figure that one out because that's not my problem, right? This is about everybody shares responsibility and care for moving the mission of the school forward without regard to your role, without regard to your department. Okay, sort of a deep care for that everyone shares collectively. And then lastly, cultivate leadership. Really, and again, a link to the other, you can see how intertwined the sides of the triangles are. Really concrete practices and structures, right, that are actively building leadership capacity in your school all the time, not just because there's a job opening, right, but are doing this all the time, in part because someday there will be a job opening, but in part because it also just increases the capacity of the school when you've got leadership, not just as an individual capacity, but actually as a system or school-wide capacity. Okay. So really concrete structures and practices around this. One of the best pieces of advice when I became a principal from sort of a mentor of mine at the time, I was hadn't even started the job yet, I was getting ready to move in and was talking to him about this, and he said, the first thing you should do is figure out who's going to replace you. Which just always really stuck with me. He said the first thing you should start thinking about is how to replace yourself. And that I thought was really powerful and has stuck with me. So clarifying questions about any of these three things? All right, so going to give you just a couple minutes here to there we go. Going to give it a couple of minutes here, again, to think about this side of the triangle in your context through these questions. Okay? Get to it. Laughing usually doesn't mean a positive diagnosis. Sorry, guys. you break the thermostat, Liz? Oh, all right. Yeah. Every room I've been in is either an ice box or a sauna. Yeah. So one of the
Do you have a few seconds after this to touch base real quick? Okay.
Yeah.
We want to find a time hopefully to meet while we're here.
Absolutely.
To do some planning.
Yeah, love to. Yeah, so I'll linger for a few minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure. Liz. All right, I'm going to have to pull us back. Oh, jeez. All right, let's come back together here. All right, so we are kind of in the home stretch of our time together. One of the things I'd hope we would have more time to do is actually to transition and to start talking about strategies that have worked for each of you in your schools as you've taken up some of these issues. We're not going to have a lot of time to do that, but I will say when you look at those slides that have notes in them, note that some of those notes actually are about strategies. Okay, so there are some in there as well. So we've gotten sort of end of unpacking those slides. What I want to do is sort of walk you through the whole framework quickly here in just a moment. But anything big jumping out at you or really in the front of your mind as we walk through the three sides of that triangle right now?
together. Not have one side of the triangle larger than the other.
Yeah. Yeah, that all three matter, right? They're really deeply intertwined. For those of you who were in the focusing on the core session this morning, right, there's a parallel sort of parallel dimension here between that student focus, right, where in the idea of the instructional core, and you have to go after all three elements. The same is true here, right? There are times when we're relatively weaker or stronger at one versus the other, right? But all of them need to be in place for your school to really be well positioned to learn at a high level. Okay. Anything else jumping out for folks? Yep.
So we were talking about this idea of shared responsibility, and to kind of piggyback on what was said over here about kind of equal sides of the triangle. Totally agree. Saw a super strong connection between the shared responsibility on the leadership side and just the idea of building culture, right? And that psychological safety. So huge connections there, and I see that as an issue on our staff. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about is how do we foster that sense of shared responsibility? How do we ensure that every staff member is like in it and owning it and understanding that others own it? And so it came down to, I want to ask our staff, how do you feel connected to your colleagues? How do you feel connected to your students in your classroom? How do you feel connected to the students outside of your classroom? How do you feel connected to the large community? And then how do you feel connected to the idea of our school? And so that, personally, that was the epiphany, the idea of our school, and wanting to kind of help people think about that, and those levels of connection to really foster that sense of shared responsibility.
Great. And those are exactly what Kevin was articulating, was where I'd hoped we'd have more time to spend in those types of conversations. But we are going to run out of time here.
Can I put a seed out right for everybody to think about?
Absolutely.
Real life experience, one of my best managers. I've worked in several, this is my third career. My best manager I worked for, in leadership, was I was working in a print shop. I was the very end of the production. And the best manager, they're seldom came by and bothered me. Anytime an important job came through, he'd come by and walk by and say, Danny, keep an eye out for this job, and walk off. I owned that job. Mm-hmm. And I was one of the best in the state of what I did. But that's what that's the leadership, that giving ownership to the people on the leader.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Yeah, Mackenzie.
I had something that I really liked from the Summer program right there.
Yeah.
But it came up with the last question in the last one, like what would happen if your principal or anybody's gone tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a hard time answering that because I don't see what they do. I know a lot of times my principal is just gone all the time. I know they've gone on meetings in court and
Mm-hmm.
trainings and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But since they're not there, I don't know if they do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm in my own stuff, doing my own stuff. So what I would like to have is some sort of like responsibility matrix. So it goes down all of the different individuals and groups. We have so many PLCs, we have so many different organizations that I'm just a part of. I'm like 4 different entities within the school and then one person. It's so confusing. But then also within that, the shared responsibilities, so we all know this is what I'm supposed to do at this part, but this is what we're all supposed to do together.
Great. So these are some really good questions coming up. And so I actually want to bring us back to the framework and talk about the whole thing, not just the outside of the triangle, and how it gets at some of these questions. Okay, so the idea we talked about at the start, the idea of the framework, the sort of first idea is that it's important for the school to come together around something in terms of getting better, in terms of improvement. Okay. Both the questions that Kevin and Mackenzie raised about, I don't know what my principal does, or sort of shared responsibility and connection to culture and the mission of the school. Interestingly, going in a room and talking about your culture can get you something, but think about project-based learning. How do you learn in project-based learning? By doing the work, right? So the best way to get at some of these things, the most powerful way, at least that's the assumption of this framework, is not to go in a room and talk about your culture, not to go in a room and create a new job matrix, not because those aren't good things to do, but the best way is actually to engage deeply in doing the work. Doing the work, set about the work of improving some aspect of student learning, and that actually, when you go deep around something, is going to sort of bring you into collision with all these issues that you're raising and give you a platform to talk about them and start to change them. Right? So the first thing is that this idea of a focus. I'm going to use a school in the network that did a little bit of work around this year and are going to try to continue it next year, just as an example. They were feeling a little frustrated by what they were seeing in terms of written products, and written products in a lot of different ways, you know, display boards that happen in presentations and the quality of writing, punctuation, grammar, whatever, you name it, kind of every aspect of writing that would show up there. And so they were seeing a lot of problems. They came up in a lot of different ways, but they kind of realized over time we're all actually having the same conversation about our frustration with the writing capacity of our students. Okay? So they started to think about that. The first thing they did actually was, as they started to talk about that, they said, well, maybe let's just sort of audit what we're doing in our projects, because we don't actually know what one another are doing. And so they actually came up with a plan one day during their whole staff PD to go into one another's Echo briefcases and using the project elements to sort of audit everybody's briefcases. And then they came back together, not with any sort of name information, and literally they sort of had a matrix of the project elements and put just sticky dots right up, and all of a sudden they had this big data display about every project in the second semester of the year and every element that it had or was missing. What do you think was missing in almost all of them? Yeah, so writing and specifically literacy tasks, right? Okay, so now we've got the makings of a real focus. So let me also be really clear about what a focus is. Project-based learning isn't a focus. Literacy tasks aren't a focus. Your focus is the thing about student learning that you want to change. So the writing ability of your students is actually the focus. Project-based learning or literacy tasks or whatever might be the thing you're going to go after to change that. But the focus is the thing about student learning that you're trying to change. That's really, really important. Okay. So you can see just by that, they identified some data, right? They went into those Echo accounts, generated some data, they did some analysis of it, and it led them to a pretty clear strategy, which was to get really serious and focused around implementing literacy tasks in all of their projects from that point forward, and to really sort of commit themselves to learning more about what it means to be a good writer and to teach writing. So sort of committing themselves in their staff time to reading and to talking about writing and then immediately applying it to their work. So as they did that, they continued to sort of work through this cycle, and one of the things that came up for them, and again, not everything is going to come up every time as you work through this, but one of the things they bumped into pretty early was the presence, a really strong personality, a really dominant personality in their director, and a real complete sort of absence of this. Right? Because anytime someone would sort of express a dissenting opinion, this issue around, well, maybe you're not really committed to our work, or maybe you're not really committed to the mission of our school, or it's this sort of, you know, well-intentioned effort to keep everybody focused on the mission, but what it did was really undermine this aspect of their culture, the ability of people to have rich, robust, critical dialogue and to feel safe in offering any sort of critical insight about the work. Okay? So very quickly, as they started to get deep into this, they realized they didn't have this. And the way that showed up was it meant they could, despite the fact that if you went into their staff meeting, they'd all be sitting around tables like this, and they'd be talking about stuff, no one would actually say anything to anybody that would push anybody's practice. Okay. A former colleague of mine, Maggie Bello, who's now a principal of a school in Washington, D.C., we had a similar issue when we were working together, and she one day sort of came up with this term, said, we have a culture of nice. Like, we're all sitting around the table, we're all collaborating, we all bring our student work, right? But actually there's really not much sort of pushing or critical thinking or really robust feedback going on in those times. And I really love that term that she came with, this sort of culture of nice. Right? And that was true for them. It was true for them because of, quite frankly, because of fear, right? But that is sort of what they had adopted as a way to deal with that, is to cope with that. Okay. In their case, in the particular case of this school, they actually had a pretty good set of structures in place in terms of time and space. What they didn't have, as they got deeper and deeper into this, they realized was any really concrete processes for learning. Some folks I was talking with talked about how their sort of PD time looked different every time they got together. Like they sort of did different stuff, they talked about different stuff. That was true for these guys too. While they had good conversations and they often had good content in there, there was little continuity, and they almost never actually looked at student work. So one of the things they got really, really serious about was to start to look at and really explore concrete protocols that always bring them back to student work. All right. And again, on the leadership side of this, we already sort of named what was going on here, right? But there was sort of, this was the big issue on the leadership side. It's not always the case that something's going to show up every time, but if we had said, okay guys, we're going to go in a room and talk about our leadership issues, what would have come out of that? What? Yeah, probably some grumbling. Yeah, someone might have said something, right? But probably not much meaningful. What happened here was as they got deeper and deeper around the work, what this did was allow them to see how it impacted their ability to change and advance student learning. And that's a much more motivating reason to start to take on some of these challenges, right, than just someone called me out. Right. So the idea here is that by going deep around a very specific focus for student learning, it actually allows you to see the entire system and begin to transform it, to be really intentional as you work through that process about the different conditions in your school and in your system that impact your ability to learn. All right. A couple of quick thoughts and then we're out of here. So Kevin mentioned this in his comment about getting everyone together around this purpose. One of the reasons that I would argue it's really powerful and important to have the entire school community come together around a common focus is because it helps you look like the graphic behind me. When schools do really powerful things, graphically they often look like this. Right? They have this very large, profound sense of purpose that sits at the center of all their work. And everyone and everything is tightly linked together around that purpose. Right? Often when we work with new schools and they come to our new schools training, this is often what they look like right after that week is over. Right? Because they've had this big, intense experience. They've really come together around some things. And this is often, you know, at the end of July where those schools look like. When we come visit in February, they sometimes look like this. So what's changed? Yeah, so they move further away from one another and from the sense of purpose. What else? Yeah, the color's different, right? What happens when this happens, when people start to move out, what happens is you start to substitute individual purpose for shared purpose. And in that scenario, you will probably get some good classrooms, you'll probably get some good projects. What you won't get is a great school. And then the last thing you see there, right, the sense of purpose is actually much smaller. Right? People are much less connected to it. The really frustrating thing about this diagram is that you don't have to do anything wrong to end up looking like this. You just have to not be vigilant. One of the ways I submit to you that you can be vigilant is to always have something that brings you together as an entire school that you're focused on and working on. It's one way for you to be really vigilant about this. I'm thinking about a bunch of things, but that could certainly fit in. Oh, sorry, this isn't supposed to be animated. That's a mistake. You got way more gratuitous animation than most groups. Last thought, and then I get out of here. So one of the things we talk about with schools all the time, or comes up quickly, particularly when I'm talking to principals or assistant principals, particularly superintendents, is this question about sustainability. I mean, how do we become really, really sustainable? But sustainability is an idea. If we look at it, if we look into what sustainability means in organizations, it means the ability to keep doing what you're doing right now over an extended period of time, right? To do it over and over and over again. By that definition, I would argue that American public high schools are the most wildly sustainable thing we've ever come up with. They recreate themselves over and over and over again without anybody ever getting in a room and saying, what should high school look like? What we don't do well, what schools ironically don't do well, is learn and adapt. They don't have the capacity to solve, to learn their way out of problems together, and to keep continuously achieving their purpose, even as things around them change, as people turn over, so on and so forth. So I want to submit to you that really the goal we're after here is the adaptive capacity of your school. The ability of your school not to be sustainable, not to keep doing what you're doing, because as your environment changes, that's not a guaranteed recipe for success. But your ability to be adaptable, to stay centered on a common shared purpose, and to continually find ways to enact that purpose no matter what changes around you, that's what we want for our schools. Right? And that's a scenario where you're going to continually produce great outcomes for your kids over time. Thank you guys for a really great engagement at the last time section of the day. Have a great afternoon and a great rest of the conference.